The rain came down as though the sky itself were obliged to witness a transaction, a cold, steady percussion on the leaded panes of Ashbourne Hall. In the dim of the morning drawing-room, a fire fought a losing battle with the damp and cast long fingers of light that trembled over maps and ledgers. Margaret Ashbourne stood with her gloved hands clenched around a letter she had not yet read, her skirts whispering against the rug, her hair streaked with silver like threads of frost. At 42, she wore the look of someone who had lived many small deaths and kept breathing. Society called her sensible, her father called her useful, and the world beyond the hedgerows called her the last of the Ashbourne line, whose dowry might be counted like cattle and rents. Lord Elias Ashbourne, her father, a marquess whose comportment had been honed by accounts and etiquette rather than tenderness, folded his hands as if closing a ledger, and made an announcement that was both businesslike and irrevocable. "Your marriage has been settled," he said, with a voice that was the sound of shutters being latched. The Duke of Blackwell, known among whispers as the Duke of Shadows because of his reclusive ways and the rumors that rode ahead of him like a dark cloak, will claim you in a month. The papers are prepared. There are reasons of alliance and inheritance, and the estate will profit," he added, as though he were describing the weather. "You cannot be serious," Margaret said, the words small and sharp, landing on the damp air. Her heart beat with that odd rising ache that had nothing to do with fear alone, and everything to do with the barter of a life. "My life is not a parcel to be signed over," she said, and the tremor in her hands betrayed the force of her refusal. Her father did not raise his voice. Impatience was a softer tyranny than anger. "Practicalities must govern," he reminded her. "The family is endangered by debts, and the alliance is sound. You will have security," he said. "You will have a title." Society expected her to accept, to bow to the arrangement that would secure the lineage and please the vassals who liked things kept in order. Margaret desired, privately and fiercely, a different truth. To keep her mornings, her small rituals of tea and the reading of letters, the quiet freedom of walking the garden at dawn. For him, this was a repair to the books. For her, it was an erasure of days she had built slowly and stubbornly. She had 3 weeks until the formal courtship began, 3 weeks to brace and to wonder whether resistance would mean ruin for those she loved. She could remain a dutiful daughter and be bought, or she could defy the Marquess and risk everything. She left the drawing-room as rain made a small, constant music on her umbrella. The stables smelled of high and iron and the deep animal warmth that had always been Margaret's medicine. She ran a hand along the flank of an old mare, feeling the horse's pulse under her palm like a small, steady drum. "I will not go quietly," she whispered to the creature, to the damp air, to the emptiness of the corridor. Yet beneath defiance there was a thought that pricked like cold. What if the man they called the Duke of Shadows was not monstrous, but only lonely, in a different way from her own? That question, simple and dangerous, lingered like the scent of rain on leather. If you were in Margaret's place now, how would you answer a bargain set by lineage and ledger, when safety for the many demands the sacrifice of the one? We know such choices sting with anger and fear and longing at once. Share your answer below. Begin your reply with "I choose," so voices are easier to read. And tell us whether you would accept the marriage to guard your family, or refuse to claim a life of independence, even if it meant peril. Your words help those facing hard paths feel less alone, and they shape conversations we keep returning to in these tales. Thank you for your honesty. Now the story goes on, and the next scene shows Margaret escaping to where she breathes best, to the stables, and to a decision that will echo in more than accounts and titles. The stable-yard was a wet, honest place, with the smell of tack and the muffled call of barn owls. And there Thomas, the old butler, who had once been Margaret's tutor in arithmetic, stood hands folded and eyes down, as if he carried both loyalty and secret sorrow. William, the stablemaster, stooped to fit a saddle to a mare, while Ruth, the head maid, folded damp cloths into a steady square. Margaret arrived breathless and damp at the collar, and the conversation that followed had the rhythm of people who had rehearsed restraint, but not affection. "You should not be out in such weather," Thomas said, his voice low with reprimand and worry. He knew how to veil fear in admonition. "I cannot let them sign away my mornings," Margaret replied, and there was steel in the softness of her words. William snorted and stuck a bridle in her hands. "You have always loved horses more than other company," he said, though he was not unkind. Ruth smoothed Margaret's sleeve with an almost maternal gesture. "You will need sensible goots, not those things with heels," she advised, then added with a wry tilt of lips, "The Duke will not respect muddied hem." Margaret looked at the assembled faces, at small lines that had appeared where worry had taken hold. "Will they take the house, too?" she asked, the question more rhetorical than literal. Thomas sighed. "They take bargains as if they were ploughs. Once the furrows cut, there is little room to sow again," he said. Margaret mounted the mare, feeling the leather between her legs and the animal's slow exhale, and in the cadence of hoofbeats she mapped possibilities. There were 8 exchanges in that little colloquy, each one a thread. Admonition, defiance, practical counsel, maternal teasing, a worried question, a wise observation, a quiet joke, and finally a steadying silence as Margaret rode toward the ridge to look back at the manse she had known all her life. The wet wind carried away some of her resolve, and left others, and the stable smelled of salt and earth and the faint sweetness of oats. Margaret's life before this morning had been small rebellions wrapped in the acceptable. Her mother died when she was 31, the estate then a responsibility that the Marquess accepted as a duty rather than a loss to grieve. She had been engaged once, in her 20s, to a captain who died in a fever in a foreign port, and whose letters she kept locked in a box beneath her work-table. After that there were suitors enough to keep the house in decent coin, but never the one who set her heart afire, and she learned to be careful with hope. In the years that followed she became a manager of rooms and accounts, learning the fine balance of keeping tenants content while mending fences, literally and figuratively. She had argued with tenants about boundaries and negotiated with solicitors over wills. She had read maps by candlelight and counted roofs with the quiet devotion of someone who knew that an estate was a web of small lives. There is a particular ache in being a woman of 42 in a world that measures worth in future heirs and bridal bloom, and Margaret had met that ache with a kind of stubborn grace. She had friendships with a few solid people, with Thomas, whose memory of Latin was better than the Marquess' understanding of love, with Ruth, who understood how to mend a sleeve and an insult with equal skill, and with William, who knew when to be blunt and when to carry a message. The backstory of her life held the steady accumulation of duties, the loss and the slow settling of a heart into practical things. Yet within that practical shell lay a small fierce core that would not be traded without giving voice to a deeper hope than merely avoiding humiliation. It was a backstory of 3 paragraphs, like the rings of an old tree, holding both hurt and the capacity to endure. In those paragraphs the reader learns of the dead captain, the locked letters, the meticulous care of passage of tenancy, and the assurance that Margaret had never been without allies who would stand with her in quieter rebellions. Those recollections were more than explanation. They were mortar that would enable a new bridge to be built. A carriage arrived on the 3rd day of formal notice, a low thing of black leather that exhaled cold when its door opened. The man who stepped out was tall and moved like someone who had been schooled to command rooms with half a look. He wore simple clothes of a kind that refused ornament. Even his coat was cut for economy rather than show. He introduced himself as Gideon Blackwell, Duke of Blackwell, though men in town had long called him Duke of Shadows for reasons that gathered like moths around a lamp. The first meeting was a study in small confidences and larger silences, each gesture a test. "You are Margaret Ashbourne," he said, and his voice was low and not unkind. "You have been offered as an alliance," her father said before she spoke, the Marquess supplying the formalities as if reading from a script. The Duke inclined his head to Margaret. "I have heard that you are wise with ledgers," he said, and there was curiosity in his gaze, not hunger. Margaret measured him as one measures a bridge before walking it. His hands showed the faint scars of a man who had once done work with his hands. His eyes read like paper where ink had soaked in and left marks. She used 8 exchanges to probe and to parry, the conversation moving from the weather to the duties of an estate to the ridiculousness of gossip. "Are you as solitary as they say?" she asked, a careful question. "I have kept much to myself," he admitted, "not for malice, but because solitude is simpler than the theater of expectation." "Do you attend to tenants?" he asked. And she laughed once. "I attend to roofs and to wills, and to the odd cat that thinks it owns the kitchen." He smiled, the humor brief but honest. There was a micro-promise in that meeting, a hint that the man appointed to take her life by contract might be a companion in the margins instead of a jailer. The ceremony was simple, a curtained thing with a handful of witnesses, the vicar reading phrases that hung like law between two people whose hearts were not consulted. The dress was sensible, brown silk with lace at the cuff, appropriate for a woman of her age who would not be paraded. There were murmurs among the vassals, polite clucks about propriety and the practicality of alliances. Margaret thought of the captain's letters, and for a moment the room narrowed to the envelope edges she had once folded into a square. She thought of the estate's books, and the way numbers could be a kind of truth. On the journey to Blackwell House, the landscapes rolled by like pages, green, then gray, then green again, and Margaret felt the shrinking of familiar things as hedges and signposts fled. The manse she had known receded until it was a shape in rain and smoke. Travel in a carriage is an intimate sort of exile. The creak of springs marking time that is neither here nor home. The Duke sat across, more companionable by silence than by speech, and in that quiet there was a small exchange, a word here, a look there, that suggested the making of a shared language. Blackwell House introduced itself as a place of shadows and careful order, a manse of deep corridors and windows that seemed to swallow light. The butler, Thomas's cousin, but of a more severe bent, offered curt salutations and a list of rules that Margaret stored like talismans. The staff were a mixture of faces both new and reassessing, as if the arrival of a new duchess called for new measurements. Ruth found a place in the kitchen of Blackwell House, her deft hands and sharp eye quickly revealing the practical advantage of an ally who could stitch a broken seam and a broken morning with equal skill. William took charge of the estate stables without complaint, and the head gardener, Miss Agnes, who had a nose for rumor as well as for soil, provided quiet commentary about the seasons. There were rules and there were rituals that the Duke enforced, not as tyrant, but as a man who had learned that certainty comforted him. He kept to hours for letters and for guests, and expected the counting of coins with a clean precision. Margaret found the library a refuge, a room with long shelves and a smell of old paper that suited her need for quiet work. The household had its own order, a choreography of kettles and curtains and the faint clack of servants' feet that made a rhythm out of domestic life. The inflection of Blackwell's isolation came with small kindnesses and odd remonstrances. The Duke taught her a way to read maps of local influence, as she had once read tenant accounts. She taught him how to coax reluctant seeds into the greenhouse.
In the first months, they lived like two people discovering a new language. Yet the rumor mill of county gossip had not ceased. It pushed at doorways and windows and demanded performance. A letter arrived that winter, an assertion of claim from a distant relative about a rite of passage, and Margaret found herself at the center of a dispute that required her practical mind and the Duke's capacity for quiet resolve. Then came a storm that tested them in ways ledger lines never could. Rain poured with a sudden cruelty that flooded the lower farmlands and washed out a bridge that was the only access to a tenant's cottage. A child, as it happened, had been left alone since the cottage's mistress had gone to market, and the tenant had sent a desperate plea that arrived at Blackwell House soaked through and smeared with mud. Without ceremony, the Duke and Margaret rode out together, cloak soaked, hands raw from ropes and reins, while thunder rolled like distant cannons. The rescue was an episode of shared labor. The Duke hauled debris, Margaret cradled the trembling child, and together they ferried the family to safety. There was a sudden laugh, startled and bright, when the child declared that the Duchess smelled like horses, and it broke something between them. The storm scene was rich in tactile details, 5 senses gathered like tools. The sting of rain on skin, the tang of river water on boots, the smell of damp wool, the roughness of rope under hand, the taste of metallic fear turned to relief. The experience forced an intimacy akin to a confession. The Duke, who had always measured emotion with economy, let a look of admiration cross his face. "You have strength," he said, "but not the show of it you imagine." And Margaret felt recognized in a way that no title had permitted. They returned to Blackwell House with mud on their hems and the sound of lambs bleating as if to welcome them. And that night, by the fire that had fought the damp for so long, they spoke for hours. There were moments of tension after that night when the past reasserted itself like a returning tide. Margaret had locked away the captain's letters, but one day a visiting solicitor produced a clause in an old will that suggested the Ashbourne inheritance might be contested if certain conditions were not met. The threat was a practical blow, a legal prick that could force the estate to be liquidated. She felt betrayed, not by the Duke, but by the cruelty of law that could unravel a life. The crisis came with a pair of conversations. One with her father, who insisted on legal avenues that smelled like surrender, and another with the Duke, who argued that they should fight in the courts rather than capitulate. In private, Margaret had a vision that came unbidden in the small hours. A fragment of memory where the captain stood at a foreign pier and waved, the gulls making a ragged chorus. The vision was equal parts longing and accusation, as though the past were asking why she had not burned the letters and sought a different future. This moment of internal fracture was followed by a confrontation with the Marquess, words like old coins thrown across a table, each side counting value in a different currency. The emotional weight of this crisis spurred an honest exchange between Margaret and Gideon, long and dense, where both laid out their fears and their grudges. The conversation used the legal language of wills and claims, but ended in something more elemental, an admission of fear and an insistence on loyalty. The scene of reconciliation that followed began in the Duke's study, a room of maps and ledgers, of a man who steadied himself with order. Their dialogue there had 10 exchanges, ranging from blunt accusations to soft confessions, each line revealing a new facet. Gideon revealed a childhood where he had been passed from relative to relative, a boy who learned to be invisible to survive. Margaret confessed that fear of dependency had made her both practical and lonely. The arc of the scene moved from suspicion to empathy, and with it a physical closeness that had been long deferred finally unfolded. They kissed not as a sealing of contracts, but as a mutual decision, slow and clean and without spectacle, a kind of baptism into possibility. Moments of tension are stitched into this narrative in 3 careful places, each paragraph shaped to hold the pressure. One such moment came when the solicitor's letter arrived, The air of the library suddenly thin with the smell of ink and worry. Margaret felt the room tilt, the spines of the books like ribs, and she pressed her palm to a volume to steady herself. The scene lasts a short breath in time, and yet stretches into eternity, and in 500 words or so, the reader sees her tremor and the practical cunning she deploys to respond. Another occurred when the Duke, in a misguided effort to protect her, forbade her from attending a tenants' meeting, and the indignity of being sheltered like a child provoked a fierce argument. The third happens when a scandal whispered in the market threatens the dignity of their shared household, forcing them to meet public eyes as one. There were technical processes Margaret mastered at Blackwell House, explanations that satisfied the mind as much as the heart. She learned the estate accounts of the neighboring manors, how tithes were allocated, and how to read the arcana of old wills in order to detect ambiguity. She recorded the steps, small and exact, for contesting a claim in a local court. Archival search for prior deeds, the summoning of witnesses, the securing of affidavits, and the careful counting of the margin of error that could turn a verdict. In a 250-word explication, she outlined how a will could be probed, how a clause might be voided by precedent, and how a housekeeper's note could prove a lineage. These technicalities, dry on paper, mattered like mortar when foundations were at stake. As winter softened into spring, there emerged an intimacy not born out of flamboyance, but of shared labor and small rituals. They planted seeds in the greenhouse together, the Duke learning the tenderness of soil, while Margaret learned the surprising measure of his patience when coaxing fragile shoots. A laugh came easy one afternoon when they found the Duke wearing a bonnet to protect his head from sun, a picture that Ruth in the kitchen described to the staff with such relish that even the butler softened. There was a slow consummation of trust, a willingness to be seen in sloppy and honest moments rather than in the curated masks required by courtly life. The crisis of trust arrived when Gideon's estranged sister, Countess Beatrice, arrived bearing accusations that the Duke's reticence had more to do
with debts than dignity. Beatrice, elegant and sharp, suggested at a dinner that alliances are sometimes marriages of convenience and nothing more. The household stilled. Margaret felt a flash of fury that surprised her. She stood and refuted Beatrice with logic and with a quiet warmth that made those present listen. The Countess left with a cooling of an eyebrow and a vow that she would watch the dynasty's theater with keener eyes. In that confrontation, Margaret won something that had nothing to do with titles, the right to be taken seriously, not as a bargain, but as a partner. In the end, the legal fight was won, not on the basis of grand speeches, but on a seam of evidence Margaret discovered in an old letter, the kind you only find if you look for a life beyond what is comfortable. She found a notation in a ledger that proved a precedent for the Ashbourne claim, and presented it at the hearing. The solicitor for the opposing party, a sleek man who wore certainty like armor, was politely undone by a small but decisive truth. The court ruled in their favor, and the estate remained intact. Margaret watched the parchment of victory like a small map to new days. The culmination of their arc was not platitude, but labor made tender. The Duke and Margaret created a household that blended governance and laughter, ledgers and lullabies. There were children in the horizon, a small, stubborn hope that fit like a seed in the palm. In an intimate scene that did not shy from the complexity of desire, they consummated love in a manner that was warm and human, a merging of two solitary lives into one careful home. They made promises, spoken in the language of small daily vows, to rise early together some mornings, to read the same book aloud on Sundays, to listen when the other spoke of old hurts. The epilogue unfolds across months and is a quiet testament to what people can remake. 1 month after the legal victory, they held a modest celebration at Blackwell House, where neighbors brought pies and the greenhouse was opened so children could chase light among the plants. 3 months later, there was a new rhythm to the estate, a schedule that allowed for a public school to receive modest funds and for tenants to petition directly to Margaret in a monthly hour she kept on her calendar. 6 months later, there was a child at Margaret's breast, eyes like tidal pools and a laugh like sunlight on brass. The man who had once been called the Duke of Shadows learned to be a father and to call the woman who had been sold to him by contract the light of his house. The epilogue is measured in tender, concrete details. At 1 month, they planted a willow by the river as a symbol of resilience, a small ceremony attended by those who had helped them through.
Storms. The Duke carved initials into the bark with a knife that belonged to Margaret's captain, a relic she had once considered too precious to share. At 3 months, the household had reorganized its accounts to fund a new infirmary and to pay for apprenticeships for 2 tenant sons, a change that was both practical and emblematic of a different priority. At 6 months, the infant slept in a room filled with books and a shawl that Ruth had knitted with a pattern from Margaret's childhood. The house that had once been a repository for loneliness was now marked by the sound of a small footfall and the smell of fresh bread in the morning. In the end, the story is not about who purchased whom, but about the buying and selling of fear for the currency of companionship. What began as a sale transformed into a partnership built by argument and by laughter and by the steady rearrangement of priorities. The social order that once insisted on cold exchange learned to make room for warmth. Margaret discovered that autonomy can be preserved within a union and that duty can expand into desire. The records will show estates balanced and ledgers tended, but the truer measure will be the way mornings passed with 2 cups of tea and a joint plan for a greenhouse. If this tale has touched you, leave a comment and tell us whether you would keep a bargain to protect others or refuse it to preserve yourself. Join us to explore more lives that bend historical constraints into something human. Some bonds are made of iron, some of paper, and some of the small, ordinary acts that 2 people perform day after day until what was once duty becomes home.